Housing is Your Right. This workshop was going to be led by the Civil Action Practice team of the Bronx Defenders. We are so excited to have Gillian Leatherberry with us tonight, Ashley Gonzalez, Jaden Powell, and Sia Hegde. They're going to be our presenters, walking us through the history of housing in the Bronx, as well as what are our rights, what are techniques that we can learn to advocate for our needs as tenants. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters for the evening.
Great. Thanks so much, Sadea, and the whole DreamYard staff for making us join you with this event. It's always fun to have external collaborations with our Bronx community. And we commend all of you for the work that you all do in system transformation, art advocacy, social justice. It's amazing. So my name is Sia Hegde. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am policy counsel to the Bronx Defenders Civil Action Practice. I won't dwell too much more on our work, but the Bronx Defenders is a holistic public defender office. We serve upwards of about 20,000 Bronx residents every year, not just in civil venues, the civil court systems, but as well as criminal, deportation proceedings, and family proceedings. And so our work is going to be grounded on housing as the subject matter of this presentation lends itself to. And before we sort of kick off the formal PowerPoint, we're going to be starting with a brief icebreaker led by Jaden, followed by the PowerPoint, a discussion, and a brief role play exercise. So lots to cover in about 50 minutes, but I think we can do it. I'm going to just pass the torch to Jaden.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaden. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a staff attorney in the Civil Action Practice at the Bronx Defenders. And I work on a team-based team, as Sia was explaining. So I represent people in housing court, but also any civil issues that we cover that pop up in our holistic practice. So actually, like Sia said, I am going to kick us off with kind of an icebreaker question that we wanted to pose to everybody and share just so we can get to know each other a little bit. The question is, what does home mean to you? I'll kick us off that home to me means my dog. I just adopted a dog last summer, so cuddling on the couch with my dog is home to me at this moment in my life. So people are free to come off of mute and share or drop it into the chat. We also want to open a space for people to drop questions they might have or issues that are on the top of their mind that have to do with housing. We want to preface that by saying, this isn't a legal clinic. We're not going to be giving specific legal advice, but we can give general information based on topics or questions that you might have. So please feel free to drop it in the chat if you have questions or issues, or you can direct message it to me or any of us that are presenting, and we'll make sure that we try to cover that issue. I'll read some of the chat now, and if someone wants to come off mute and share and introduce themselves, please feel free to do so. So I'm seeing Shemaine says, home to me is my safe place. And please type if I said that wrong or come off mute. Shanika says, home is where my kids are and we are safe. So safety seems to be a theme of home, which makes a lot of sense. If anybody else wants to share, please, again, feel free to jump off mute.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gillian. I am the training director in the Civil Action Practice at Bronx Defenders. My pronouns are she and her. It's really great to be with you all this evening. I'm really excited for our time together. I was thinking about this question. I think I have lived with family, and that's a big part of it for me. I've also lived alone in my life. So I was trying to think about the one common thing. I also adopted a cat within the last year, so I have that in common with Jaden, that pets signify home to me, but I haven't always lived with pets. So what I came up with is home is a place where I can rest, and I think that I heard you all also talk about safety. I think that's a big part of being able to rest. I have actually also lived in a home that isn't safe all the time. So that, acknowledging that can be a part of the experience as well. But that's what I'll say for now. Thank you.
We have a lot more people sharing that home is being with kids. That's the big thing, which I guess for me and Gillian, our kids are our animals right now. I see home as familiarity, my foods and family. I think from Saudea, and Daisy says, wherever my family and friends are. I see security again in Spanish. Warm food. Shout out to Marielle for the food. Home is warm food, and your food specifically.
Hi, I'm Ashley, she, her pronouns. I'm the right to counsel attorney at the Bronx Defenders, where I do eviction defense. Home to me is where my family is and where I can be my most authentic self. I think to me that's really important for home. And I don't have pets, but I have plants. So wherever my plants are, I feel that is home as well.
I love that. I love all of these answers so much. I always think of home as a place that I can return to. I currently live alone, but I've also shared space with others that I've really cared about abroad, in other cities here. Obviously during the pandemic, where it's just been so difficult to really find stability in whatever way that means to us. And so I think of home as a return point that I feel comfortable, safe, and myself in. So thanks for that question, Jaden. So we do have a PowerPoint presentation that Gillian has so graciously offered to share through her computer. So I will give it a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds for her to do that. But this first segment, and we're hoping to get the presentation, we're running about 15 minutes or so for the presentation, so we can have a little bit of time to provide more of an interactive exercise with all of you, and obviously answer questions as they come up. As Jaden said, please feel free to use the chat at any time. We're going to try to be as generous with time towards the end as we can. So the first section, we thought it would be really important before we delved into a know your rights, housing rights, more substantive law angle to this presentation, to really ground ourselves in how housing in the Bronx has played out historically, and sort of the place where we're at today. And by we, I want to just acknowledge that it's we as a community, and not by any means calling out any particular circumstance, but just historically what we've seen. When we talk about our housing history, right, we can't disassociate it from the connections that it has to race, poverty, class dynamics. In one particular theory that was coined as something called racial capitalism, we've seen time and again how predominantly white property owners have profited from Black lives and Black labor in a very market-centered corporate capitalist economy. So something that's driven by a lot of profit. Historically, when Black people tried to acquire property, they were given far less market access to do so than their white counterparts, which is something that we of course still see as a pattern today. In short, predominantly white institutions, so organizations, systems of law that were shaped predominantly by white people, we've seen derive economic, monetary value from non-white people. And what that's done through a lot of policies that I'll kind of allude to in the course of the next few minutes is that it's left a lot of exploitation. It's left a lot of displacement of poor working class people of color. And so against this theoretical backdrop, what we saw in sort of the 1840s and 50s in New York was this anti-rent war that it didn't necessarily fall on the Bronx in particular, but it was more of a statewide economic crisis. And what that did was that it induced landlords to drive tenants out of their home for rent default, so AKA evictions. That's sort of like the grounding place of where we saw a lot of eviction wars, and before there was really a court system in place for tenants to fight those evictions, there was a lot of informal advocacy. There was a lot of policy where the legislature was lobbied for over 20 years as tenants started to sue landlords or create a system where they could try to get accountability. Through the 20th century, so now we're going into the 1900s, there were all of these very racialized governmental policies that contributed to what we've known and identified as housing segregation in the Bronx. In the early 30s, there were over 200 buildings in the Bronx where tenants were on rent strike. They demanded a 15% rent reduction to end evictions. They demanded an end to poor quality housing. In some instances, the police were involved and tenants attacked the police, rallied against, their needs. And that, again, sort of became a starting point of organizing that we saw in the Bronx that has carried on into a very robust tenant movement. And in the kind of mid 1930s, so now we're looking about a few years later, right after the Great Depression, there was this very, very harmful policy that the federal government under the Federal Housing Administration put into place. And that was called redlining, which is probably something that a lot of you have at least heard of in some which way or form. And through redlining, the whole kind of purpose of it was a federal policy to extract capital, to extract money from Black families. Not only what ended up happening was that banks would choose not to approve loans for Black families in under-resourced communities, specifically for housing that was substandard, that was in disrepair. This caused a lot of prospective homeowners, Black people who wanted to be property owners, to end up with loans that they just couldn't afford to keep up with. And that was because of property that was unaffordable, that was in disrepair. And in places like the Bronx, this legacy of redlining starved communities of resources. It contributed to divestment, taking resources away from communities. And in fact, there was a physical red line that insurance companies and banks had drawn around specific neighborhoods where they vowed not to provide home insurance, mortgages, right? Ways that property owners could actually become property owners, or excuse me, specifically Black minority people in the community could become property owners. In the 70s, and this is a kind of another big catastrophic event that we saw affect the Bronx in very, very wide, pervasive ways. We saw this cascade of arson fires, the Bronx fires, which again is something that has a very strong legacy even today when we think about the ways that fires have shaped people's abilities to stay housed. 80% in the 70s, 80% of the Bronx's housing stock was completely destroyed. And that displaced over 500,000 Bronx residents. What ended up happening was a lot of landlords set fires to vacant apartments, so apartments that were not filled with any occupants. They paid contractors to do this in order to collect insurance money after they hadn't received money from rent. On average, there were about 40 fires a day in the Bronx, which was about 12,000 a year, an astounding number. There are other policies, I won't really get into the nuts and bolts of this, but there were sort of big, widespread policies like gentrification, outcomes where private housing in other urban areas sort of became monopolized by people who were trying to force their way into creating a new kind of culture and a new matrix of what housing looked like. And this forced a lot of low-income minority families to search for housing elsewhere and to move physically from places like Manhattan into places like the Bronx, where there were instances like fires that displaced so many people, which exacerbated the poverty. It wasn't until the 70s that we had New York City's housing court system kind of come into place. And then, as Ashley's going to talk about in a bit, 2017 is when right to counsel, the civil right to counsel, where tenants could have lawyers represent them in housing proceedings, became a reality in New York. So lots of stuff kind of to unpack in the last 150 or so years of our history. And I'm going to just touch on one quick thing in the next slide. Okay. And then not so much, unfortunately, has changed, which is a really, really sad thing to kind of name when we think about housing as a human right and the ways that it should be preserved as a human right. New York City is home to some of the largest, most profitable corporations, specifically loaners in the country. And landlords have historically acquired private properties. They've, again, devalued those properties and profited from the debt and the displacement of tenants, specifically in places like the Bronx. And the outcome has been profit over people. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to, I think it's Jaden next. Sorry, Gillian. Gillian's next.
Thanks, Sia. So we're going to speak about next some of the rights that you all have as tenants, as people living in dwelling spaces in the Bronx and in New York City. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is that in most cases, generally, you have the right to remain in your dwelling, in your apartment, in your house, until a city marshal or a sheriff comes to evict you. Now, that is very important because sometimes landlords will threaten to evict people, and it is actually illegal under the law for anyone, whether that's a landlord or the super or someone else, to evict you or threaten to evict you before going through the court process. Now, there are some exceptions to that right. The law says that in order to be covered by the law, you have to have been living in wherever you're living for 30 consecutive days, at least that long. And also there are some cases that say that if you're sort of, just staying with someone, maybe you're not paying rent at all, there may be some cases where the tenant or whoever is living with you can ask you to leave. But most of the time, especially if you're renting an apartment from a landlord, you have, they cannot just kick you out, just evict you without going to court first. Now, landlords sometimes do illegal things. So if a landlord does do that, if your landlord changes your locks, or tries to evict you or threatens to evict you, you can file a case in housing court. Now, that may seem a little bit daunting, and it definitely can be, but Ashley is going to talk about later that after you make the initial filing, you may be connected with an attorney who may be able to help you with that case. If you are locked out, you can also try calling the police, and the police are aware of this law. And sometimes they can be helpful in telling the landlord or the overtenant, if you're renting from someone who's living in the apartment, that they can't just evict you, that they have to go to housing court. Now, I did want to mention that, but at the same time, for a lot of our clients at the Bronx Defenders, a lot of them are over-policed. A lot of people of color, Black people in particular in the Bronx, are heavily surveilled and policed. And we know that calling the police does not always help, and often it does not help. So that is a decision that you would have to make, but and hopefully this will not happen to you, but if it does, that is an option if you would want to go that route. But if you remain locked out, you can file a case in housing court. And in the Bronx, that is at the courthouse that's right at the intersection of Grand Concourse and 161st Street. It's the big courthouse with all of the columns and the statues. I think it's important to know about this law because even if it never happens to you, which hopefully it won't, when you are speaking to your landlord, if your landlord does threaten to evict you or the super threatens to evict you for non-payment of rent or for another reason, I want you to know that in the vast majority of cases, you do have the right to stay in the apartment, and the landlord, it's illegal for the landlord to just evict you without going to court first. And if anyone violates the law, it is actually, it can be charged as a misdemeanor in criminal court, but also the landlord may have to pay fines and penalties. So the good news is that a lot, especially bigger landlords, know about this law. So a lot of the time, the landlord, knows that it is illegal to evict someone without going to court first. So that is the first right, is the right to remain in your home in most cases, until the court process finishes and a city marshal or a sheriff evicts you. At the end of the housing court case, it's the landlord still cannot evict you then. They have to hire a city official to do that. So I will pass it to the next slide. So Jaden is going to talk about the housing court process.
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. And I just want to give the largest theme of what Gillian just said, because I know that maybe some people missed it due to the translation being out. But the bottom line of Gillian's information was that you cannot just be locked out of your home without going to court. You have a right to stay in your home no matter what until a judge and a marshal say that you must be evicted and come evict you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in my part of the presentation. So now to kick off my slides. So first of all, you have a right to notice for what you're going to be sued for. Before your landlord can try to evict you in housing court, they must give you notice that they are considering evicting you. And this is called predicate notice. You might receive this notice in the mail or affixed to your front door, or potentially slid under your door, or it might be handed directly to somebody in your house or to you. Getting a predicate notice does not mean that you must leave your home or that you can be removed from your home. You are not being evicted when you receive this notice. This notice just means that your landlord is starting the process to go to housing court. Receiving a predicate notice likely means that your landlord has a lawyer and they know they can't remove you until you go to court. If your landlord's lawyer does try to communicate with you, you do not have to speak to them, and you can tell them that you don't want to speak to them or you want to wait until you have a lawyer. And if you do have a lawyer, you should direct all communication to your lawyer. Your landlord's attorney should not be trying to speak to you without your lawyer's permission or without your lawyer present. So now we're going to talk about the types of eviction cases. We can go to the next slide. So types of cases in housing court. There are two types of eviction cases and two general reasons you could be sued in housing court. The two types of cases are non-payment cases and holdover cases. A non-payment case means that your landlord is claiming that you have unpaid rent that's often called arrears. In these cases, if the rent gets paid, the case will be over. Defenses to these types of cases might be a failure by agencies like HRA or Section 8 to pay some portion of your rent if you have a subsidy. Another defense might be that there are needed repairs in your home. You have a right to habitable living conditions. This includes freedom from harassment by your landlord, as well as your landlord making the repairs that are needed in your home. This relates to another type of case in housing court, which isn't an eviction case, but is actually in a case that you can bring against your landlord. Like what Gillian was talking about, if you were illegally locked out of your apartment, you could go to housing court and sue your landlord for that. You can also go to housing court and sue your landlord in something called an HP case. HP stands for housing part. And this part of housing court is for tenants to sue landlords for repairs, because again, you have a right to habitable living conditions. But before you start a case about these living conditions, you should notify your landlord about the needed repairs in writing. Then when you go to court, you can say that you have already asked them for the repairs and they have not done them. Okay. We can move on to the next type of case, the holdover case, which means that your landlord is suing to evict you for a reason other than the non-payment of rent. Oh, yeah, there we go. My slides got confused. A holdover case, again, your landlord is suing you for something other than non-payment of rent. They might be claiming that you don't have a tenancy anymore, or that they think you violated your lease, or your lease expired, or you never signed a lease. So actually, Gillian, can we pop back to the non-payment case? One slide back. There we go. So back to non-payment cases. To start a non-payment case against you, the predicate notice necessary is that your landlord first must tell you that you missed rent. Under the law, you have a 5-day grace period after the rent is due to pay rent. So if your landlord wants to sue you for unpaid rent, they have to send you a notice that you missed rent after that 5-day grace period. If your landlord doesn't do this, you can use it as a defense in a non-payment case. You must receive this notice through certified mail. After you receive this notice saying that you missed your rent payment, your landlord must give you another notice, which is a 14-day rent demand. And this demand must say exactly how much rent you owe and for what months. It should also tell you when you have to pay rent to avoid being sued in housing court. And that date should again be no less than 14 days after you receive this demand for rent. Once that 14 days is up, or however long the letter gives you, your landlord can sue you in housing court. And you might receive this 14-day rent demand in the mail, on your front door, slid under your door, or from someone handing it directly to you or someone you live with. Okay, now to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is, what is rent in non-payment cases? What can you be sued for in housing court? And you can only be sued in housing court for rent. Rent does not include late fees. It doesn't include legal fees. It doesn't include repair fees or anything associated with your apartment other than rent. Your landlord cannot bring you to court for these fees. Your landlord might be able to sue you in another court for these fees, but these fees cannot be the basis for a housing court case against you, and they cannot be the basis for evicting you. In addition, speaking more on late fees, your landlord can only charge you a late fee if you have not paid rent after that 5-day grace period I just discussed. So again, you have 5 days after the rent due date to pay. Once those 5 days are up, your landlord can charge a late fee. But that late fee cannot be more than 5% of your monthly rent or $50. So it certainly cannot be above $50, and depending on how much your rent is each month, it might have to be less than that. Okay, next slide. Okay, to start a holdover case against you, remember this is a case that is for something other than the non-payment of rent. Your landlord has to give you a notice and tell you why they're starting this case against you. And again, these reasons could be violating a term of your lease by disturbing other tenants with noise or music. It could be that you're violating your lease by having a pet in the apartment. Or your landlord might also just be telling you that they don't want to continue renting to you. So they're terminating your month-to-month tenancy. Or they might be just saying they don't want to renew your lease. But again, they have to give you notice that tells you why they would be starting this case and which of these reasons it was for. And the notice has to tell you by what day you have to move out or what day you have to fix the violation of your lease before you will be sued in housing court. And again, you'll receive this notice in your mailbox, on your door, or potentially by someone handing it to you or someone in your household. And lastly, I'm going to talk about just the process in housing court with my last slide. Okay, after you receive a predicate notice, like we just discussed, and if you don't do what is needed by the date on the notice, such as pay rent or fix your lease violation, you will likely be sued. And you'll know that you have been sued if you have received court papers. You'll receive them in the mail or on your door or handed to you or someone in your home. And the papers should tell you what day you have to go to court. And that day is only the beginning of the court case. You're not going to be evicted on that day listed on the court papers. Because again, for you to be evicted, 2 things have to happen. First, a judge has to give a judgment saying that you can be evicted. And then your landlord has to take that judgment to the marshal's office and use that judgment to have the marshals evict you. This whole process usually takes a while. So again, even if you get court papers, you're not going to be immediately evicted, and you're certainly not going to be evicted on the date that the court papers list for you to have to go to court. And now I'm going to pass it off to Ashley to talk about the right to counsel and what might happen on that first day when you go to court.
Okay, hello. So the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition was formed to disrupt housing court and to halt the eviction mill. The Right to Counsel Coalition is a tenant-led organization that use grassroots power with tenants, organizers, and advocates to fight for this law. The role of the tenant leaders within the organization were to ensure that friends and neighbors were part of the advocacy, recognizing that a right to counsel is not only a legal issue, but also a moral issue. We've included a clip from the documentary, and we're gonna play it now.
My name is Randy Dillard, and we are facing an eviction crisis.
My lungs had almost collapsed to stop me from breathing. 2 days later, the landlord lawyer knocked on my door. The landlord is evicting me.
98% of tenants don't have an attorney. Representation in housing court should be a right.
We're here to talk about making New York City the first city in the country to make it a right for tenants to have attorneys in housing court.
I first heard about the Right to Counsel Coalition through my work here with Catholic Migration Services.
The coalition was growing, the movement was growing, but we definitely needed to do a lot of education and outreach.
The role of the tenant leader was to make sure that we invited our friends, our neighbors.
In the face of what is happening in our neighborhoods, it is becoming more aggressive, and thus there is a need more than ever for tenants to have legal representation in court.
Because we have so many people speaking, we're going to have to start a clock at 2 minutes for each speaker.
We had to keep up this momentum and this pressure. The window was getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
We were able to kind of leverage within the power of the coalition to find resources, but at the same time to be building grassroots power to say, this is a moral issue.
So the Right to Counsel bill was signed into law in August 2017, meaning that any tenant who is sued for eviction in housing court and who is income eligible with just 200% of the federal poverty line has a right to an attorney to defend their case. It doesn't matter what kind of eviction case it is. As we heard, it can be non-pay, it can be a holdover. The tenant has a right to an attorney. For tenants who are over income, they may have a right to legal consultation or advice. Prior to the Right to Counsel bill, only 1% of tenants had a lawyer in housing court, and 95% of landlords used attorneys for eviction cases. So this law offers tenants an attorney on their team, so they no longer have to be in the fight alone. So now, after the implementation of the law, 71% of tenants who appear in housing court have full representation, and 84% of those tenants remain in their home. On the first visit to court, you will be in an intake part, and that will be to connect the tenant to a legal service provider. On that first day in intake part, you will not need to discuss your case. You will just need to connect to a legal service provider. And there are some other tenant resources. Bronx Defenders has a housing hotline for advice and counsel. On the next one will be on April 11th, and we do it every other Monday. We will include the number. And I want to circle back to what was discussed earlier as far as HP cases and illegal lockouts. So the group is called LEAP. While there is no right to counsel in these cases, there are a group of legal service providers that do represent tenants in these cases. You would have to ask the court to be connected to a LEAP service provider. You also, in these cases, have the right to negotiate. And by that, I mean you have the right to negotiate a settlement with your landlord to include the defenses that Jaden and Jillian previously discussed, repairs, rent that was previously paid and accounted, and the right to remain in your apartment until eviction by the marshal. So I would like to pass it back to Jaden for discussion.
Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, first of all, I want to draw everyone's attention to the resource list that was just shared in the chat. We'll also be emailing that after, but that has a lot of resources on it for you all to follow up on the things we've talked about and get help that you might need. So yeah, we wanted to just have a space to discuss kind of all of that information that we just shared with you all. So some questions that we thought we could talk about was, where do you see yourself or your experiences reflected in what we presented? And what is your response to hearing that you have these rights related to your housing? I'll put those questions in the chat too, and I'll just repeat them. Where do you see yourself or your experiences reflected in what we've presented? And what is your response to hearing that you have rights related to your housing?
Yeah, we can also address some of the questions that have come up in the chat, but want to give people the opportunity to engage with the material and anything that's been presented so far as well. So feel free to come off mute or write in the chat. And if not, well, maybe we can answer or address some of the questions in the chat.
I have a question. So definitely the repair issue thing is a big problem in my building. It's like pulling teeth. Just you would think I'm pulling teeth in order to get something done. What would be my limit? Because in order to receive the to resolve my last repair, I had to like literally harass them in order to come. So what would be my limit and how do I go about requesting?
I can kick this off. Yeah, it's probably one of the most common scenarios that I think our clients find themselves in, whether they are in a pending eviction proceeding or not. Kind of the step-by-step mechanism that we encourage our clients to take on regardless of whether they have a lawyer or not. Obviously try to put anything and everything that you say to your super or your landlord in writing, make sure that you're taking pictures. And the reason that's important is obviously to show that a lot of landlords try to push back saying this is normal wear and tear of the apartment, that this is like not our fault, it's the fault of the tenant. But to really create a paper trail for if and when you go to court, if that's something that you feel comfortable doing, there's an opportunity to show that before a judge. HPD has been very, very understaffed. And I say this with like I don't know, we're not very happy admitting that, but HPD, it is their job to enforce like a remedy to fix building code violations. And so by calling 311, even if it is multiple times over, just know that that's like, again, not something that your landlord can and should retaliate against you for. So you do have the right to call 311 and they will send an inspector out, create a log of their own, and essentially make those violations, if they find violations in the building, public. There's a database that you can access as a tenant. And we're happy to share that in some of our resources as well. And so that's another way to sort of put pressure on a landlord to say that the city has now identified issues. And another thing that's important to know is like if you move forward with filing a repairs case in housing court, HPD is actually one of the named parties. So not only do you sue your landlord, but you also bring in HPD in that case. And so it, again, make sure that everyone is essentially on the same page about repair issues. So that's sort of the basic kind of step-by-step thing is like first do your due diligence, talk to your landlord, make sure that you're writing to them as often as you can be, If they're not responsive, definitely call HPD. If HPD is not, like if nothing has been done after HPD has issued violations, then unfortunately it might just need to be in the court's hands, and that process can take quite some time. But it's definitely creating a pathway for accountability, or it should.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, one thing that I would just add to that too is that I don't know, Daisy, if you're in conversation with other people in your building, but as you saw from the Right to Counsel documentary, there are community like tenant organizations in the Bronx, and often you can get involved with them, but also if you start speaking to other people in your building, you may have common issues. And there are like legal services attorneys, if there are a lot of repairs in the building, who you might be able to get to help you with a case that would be not only about your apartment, but also others in the building. Often, landlords have a lot of power, especially when they can divide up all the tenants, right? But if the tenants can come together like they did to pass the Right to Counsel law, or really like they have throughout the history of Bronx housing, like Sia was talking about, the fires that Sia was talking about in the 70s, a lot of those were actually set, like landlords would pay people to burn the building so they would get the insurance money, because they would make more money doing that than they would actually fixing the apartments and receiving rent. So that was their decision to do that. But, tenants started taking those burned out buildings and actually creating their own habitable living spaces because no one else was doing it. So I think talking to your neighbors, and also in the information sheet that Sadea put in the chat and that we'll send out, there are some tenant organizing groups that are on there if that's something that you're interested in. I think that, we have a lot of questions, so I think we're doing our best to write them down to the extent possible. We will try to answer them after this meeting and send them back to Sadea. So I just wanted to say that because I think there's a lot of questions that we're not going to be able to address.
Yeah, and I'll just, to go back to some of the questions we answered earlier in the chat. So, Nicole Lynn just gave us more context about the question about tenant versus tenant issues. And we did answer in the chat that unfortunately, legal aid organizations like us don't often take up those cases where it's tenant versus tenant. But Nicole, as you kind of explained more in your next chat about your building is mixed categories, there's family tenants and SRO tenants, and there's a lot of disturbances, it does really sound like it's something that's on your management to address. And so I would think that's something you could think about bringing an HP case about those disturbances, as opposed to against other tenants. And the hope is that your management will address those problems with the other tenants separately, and then you're not in the place of making a case against other tenants, but leaving it up to your management. And then Chamaine had the question about figuring out if the LRAP or the ERAP program was dispersed for you. And again, we answered it in the chat, but and we'll get the number out for the ERAP helpline. But if you just Google it too, it'll pop up. But we'll make sure to send it to Sadea to send out to you. But the ERAP helpline is a really useful line that you can call. Tell them that you're a tenant. Give them your name, your address. They might ask for your birth date and your social. Or the last 4 digits, and if you have your confirmation number, that will be very easy. You can just give it to them. But if you don't, you can just tell them who you are and let them know that you're trying to figure out what money was paid on your behalf. And I'm trying to see if there is any follow-up. Okay, I don't think so. I think we got Chamaine's question answered. Yes, you can call that, and they should be able to tell you exactly what money was giving out and for what months exactly. And yeah, we just dropped the call center in there again. And then we had another question about, is it legal for a landlord or management company to deny your application if you have debt in collections? And so unfortunately, the answer is yes, but there are rights that things that they're supposed to do if they're checking your debt back, checking your credit report or pulling debt reports for you. they must tell you like what they are pulling and where they're getting it from. So if they deny you based on debt and collections, they need to give you a copy of whatever report they used so that you can dispute it if it's wrong, not only with the management or the landlord, but also with whatever the reporting company is that reported this debt that might be incorrect. So it is legal, but they're also supposed to give you a lot of paperwork explaining why and where they got the information. And there's claims you might have against the landlord and the reporting company if the information is incorrect. So you definitely want to get that information. And if you do have debt and collections, or if you have collections issues, I'll just do a plug for the Claro program. It's called the Civil Legal Advice and Resource Office. It operates in all boroughs. So if you are being sued in small claims or civil court for like debt collection, they mainly do like credit card debt and other types of consumer debt. But even if you have some type of housing debt issue, you can also bring it to them, and they help all unrepresented people answer and figure out what's going on in debt collection cases against them. And I'll give that information to Sadea as well. It's a great resource. They operate it weekly. You would just bring in your court papers and they'll help you.
So there was also a question from, from Senor Guadalupe about whether there are apartments to rent for Hispanics. So I just wanted to address that question. Under the city's human rights law, as well as the state human rights law, and possibly a federal law, but really it's the state and the city that are going to be most helpful for discrimination cases. But if a landlord discriminates against someone because of their race or because of many other identifying characteristics, that is illegal discrimination. So the landlord should not be denying any applications because of someone's race or because someone speaks Spanish. That is illegal. If you think that you have faced illegal discrimination, I encourage you to call the City Commission on Human Rights. They are the agency that enforces the anti-discrimination law at the city level, and you can make a complaint with them. So I think that answers that that question. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, or if Guadalupe, if my response didn't answer your question, please feel free to follow up.
I see that it was dropped in that.
I have a question. I want to add a little. Yeah, I tried to apply to the link you sent just now, and we applied already like last year, and they sent me an email that I was selected for one of the new apartments that they was making, but they was asking for a lot of information. I sent the income of my husband. We pay taxes with the 18 number. And I sent that paper, the taxes paper, and the easy side that I received from my son, Daniel, that is in the program Dringer, because he's intellectual disability. So I applied, but they asking for too many papers. I sent the papers they asking for, but I don't know what, they said that they want affidavits. I don't know what is that, so. And I live in already 70 years in that studio. We are fine, the family. And with my son Daniel, we have a lot of struggling. I don't know, it's just a room that we have for 5 people.
Yeah.
And I was trying with the landlord where I live, like if he could move me, but I don't know if that's discrimination or not, but I don't know. They just give a new apartment, or when someone leaves the apartment, they give the apartment to someone else that maybe they paying more money, or I don't know what's the problem.
Yeah, so generally it is illegal to discriminate based on immigration status in housing. So if you think that that is something that's going on, I would encourage you to call the Human Rights Commission and make a complaint, or maybe you can just talk to them about the law. Landlords do ask for a lot of paperwork. in general. So that is part of the process. In terms of the affidavit, an affidavit is just something that is signed by someone and usually notarized as well. So it would depend on like what, I don't know what information they want in the affidavit.
I don't really know. I just read that they said that they need that paper, and I don't know what else. But I'm saying they made a lot of, I give in all the papers. I don't know what they want, and who's gonna sign the affidavit. Because we don't have no documents, so that's why we pay our taxes with the ITIN number.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Yeah. So in general, I guess, so I see that we're also at 7, unfortunately. If the prospective landlord is asking you for documentation of like your income, like that all makes sense. A lot of them do ask for social security numbers, but technically you don't have to provide that. So they should not be, discriminating based on immigration status. I see the question in the chat, other spaces that are helpful in navigating the affordable housing process. It can be hard. Bronx Defenders does not, help people find housing, unfortunately. You could call our housing hotline if you have like a specific question to see if they may be able to give you more specific advice. We can't unfortunately give you like specific advice today, but you could try calling our hotline, which is in the resource document, to see if someone could give you specific advice based on your situation. But I'm really sorry to hear that you're having all these challenges.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep trying, looking for the information, what they need, or I don't know, because they told me that I was elected for one of the apartment they was making. So I'm gonna keep trying.
Yeah. I think that
and
makes sense.
Homebase does screen applicants. Unfortunately, like the process right now has been very delayed as well, but you can always call a Homebase office that's located in the zip code that you're living in, and they can screen you for a potential voucher to try to find housing elsewhere. Those vouchers were actually, it's under what's called city FEPS. It's a city funded housing subsidy. And there are eligibility requirements that concern, like one of them used to be that you needed to have an eviction case, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case anymore. But you can always go and see if you're eligible for that. And the voucher amounts were actually increased last year under a new city law that was passed. So that's great. And it could be the case that you're given more funding just because you have a larger household size if you are eligible for that voucher. So it's good to kind of try the option. And I see that we're out of time.
Yeah, I'll pass it over to Saudea as we are out of time, unfortunately.
Thank y'all so much. This was super robust, really rich. I know that it was a short amount of time, but we recorded this session so that you can go back, pause, fast forward, rewind any parts that were really relevant to you. As our hosts from the Bronx Defenders said, we are going to make sure to email out all of the resources that came up during this meeting. So all of the documents that we dropped in the chat, the links, we'll make sure that they're sent out. And once this recording is available, we'll let you know when it's posted on the dreamyard.com/COSI website. Also, we have a e-gift card for all of our participants. So you should receive that in your email tomorrow. And we want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. If this is something that you really appreciated and needed more information about, feel free to send me an email. I'm going to drop it in the chat. And if you have any other questions about anything related to housing or tenants' rights that we didn't get a chance to get to tonight, feel free to email me too, and I'll pass it on to our team. Thank you so much. Hope that y'all have a great evening. And hope to see you at the next community organizing workshop.